Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m., Wednesday, the 19th of May, and you are watching episode 7 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight to issues affecting regional Queensland and regional Australia, and giving the voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on episode 7 is my guest, Tunny. Tunny is a noted economist and is the founder and director of Adept Economics, a Brisbane-based consultancy which specialises in economic modelling and cost-benefit analysis. He is also the Vice President of the Economic Society of Australia Queensland branch and is the Director of Early Childhood Intervention Australia. He is a former Treasury official, Australian Treasury official, with experience in domestic and international issues. Gene's expert commentary on economic matters is routinely sought by the media. Welcome, Gene.
Hello, Bill.
If I could just start you off in regards to your course to how you got to today, because I understand you're not a Brisbane boy. So let's go back to your career path.
Well, I mean, I've lived in Brisbane for most of my life now, but I was born in Townsville back in, a while ago now. And I was born in the Townsville General Hospital at North Ward there. We moved down to Brisbane when I was a teenager. So I went to uni. I didn't go to uni in Townsville. I went to uni here in Brisbane at UQ. And I spent some time in Canberra for the Treasury. I do still love the North. I don't get up there as much as I should. But Townsville and surrounds always has a special place in my heart. So it's good to keep an eye on what's going on up there and to speak with people in the region. So happy to be here.
I think it's a matter of course for a lot of people to sort of uproot their families and head down to Brisbane for better opportunities and that as time goes by. So, but hopefully one day North and the rest of the regional Queensland will grow and there will be opportunities for people in Brisbane to come to the regions.
Well, I think, Townsville is looking, it's looking a lot better than it did back in the 80s. I remember partly that was because of the drought in the 80s. So Townsville wasn't looking in very good shape, but there's been so much investment since I was there, we were living there. And I know what's been done with the Strand is terrific. That looks great. And there seems to be a lot more of the cosmopolitan feel in Townsville now, and which is great. Lots more opportunities. So yes,
I think there's a lot more effort by regional local governments and authorities to attract business to their area. I mean, in the last 12 months, I suppose, with Townsville Enterprises has got engaged in trying to get business to come there. And I think there's a big land area set aside, and they're looking at hydrogen facility and also a lithium battery facility. So there's a lot going on in regards to local government trying to get their own regions going where they possibly can, sometimes in spite of the state government.
Yeah. Well, that hydrogen economy has huge potential if it can actually work, if it can become commercial. And I think, is there some demonstration facility is it Sun Metals near Townsville? I think there's some demonstration facility or something going on there. I'll have to look that up. But
I think the main thrust of it is Kawasaki Engineering, which is heavy engineering in Japan, is behind the project. And basically what they're looking for is a green energy supply for their industries so they can get the tick of approval for being green and zero emissions. So I think that's the general thrust of the hydrogen project is at this moment is simply for Kawasaki to source I think it's only blue hydrogen at the moment, not green hydrogen, and it's shipped. All of it's shipped straight up to Japan, and it doesn't go through any network. From what I gather, it's going to simply go into Kawasaki engineering facility, sort of, to provide them with it. That's the initial concept, from what I can gather.
Right. Okay.
There's also a big one in West Australia that's got hasn't even it's just got the concept stage, but the government has already provided it with major project status, and that's in the Murchison, and its renewable is also a blue energy project at the moment. Blue energy is basically using potable water as to extract the hydrogen. When you're fully green, well, you utilize seawater, so you got to do the desalination, then use the water from that to get the accreditation for green hydrogen. I think that's the difference. So yeah, they're sort of exciting ventures for Northern Australia, should they come off in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there is a lot of opportunity if we can integrate renewables into the grid in a way that is sustainable and doesn't lead to blackouts and leads to higher power prices. So if we can solve that challenge, then the potential for renewables in Australia is large, and we have plenty of land and ample sun and wind. And Ross Garno talks often about the superpower opportunity for Australia, and I think he's right about that. But we've got some issues with renewables and in terms of integrating them effectively.
I think everything's solvable. It's just how much money you want to throw at it, and that becomes the sticking point. But if we can just move on to the budget, and have a bit of a look at that, how it affected Australia in general, and then Queensland. I'd just like to take you up on Cameron Dick's comment. We missed out. We didn't get our share, sort of thing. Throwing out the old saying, which is used by people in regional Queensland. What about our share? Where's our share? Well, it was funny for the Brisbane government to be out, well, where's our share, sort of thing, and complaining. But I did look at the project listings of the amount of money given to each state for the different projects, and I think Queensland only was allocated 1.6 billion, whereas places like South Australia were given 3 billion for some interconnecting roads and that, and it was definitely the lowest amount of any state anyway.
Yeah. So that was an additional 10 billion that the federal government has put into this budget for infrastructure spending. Now, that's not the bulk of the money that goes to Queensland, right? So this is a point I made on Steve Austin's show on ABC Radio here in Brisbane last week. Cameron Dick's referring to just this 10 billion, but that's across Australia. We got under 2 billion, whereas other states, well, I think Cameron Dick's saying, well, given we've got the strong population growth, we should be getting something like 3 or something. And look, he's possibly got a good point there. But what we've got to keep in mind is that the bulk of the money that we get out of the budget comes about through the redistribution of the GST revenue, and that's according to a formula that's overseen by the Commonwealth Grants Commission. And at the moment, we're actually doing better in per capita terms. So we're getting above what we would get if that were distributed on a population on a per head basis, equal per head basis. We actually do a bit better out of that. And there's also the money that comes from what they call payments for specific purposes, the tied grants, money for health and education. So in 2021, the Commonwealth, so this is the financial year we're currently in the budget, they're estimating that Queensland is getting $16,078 million, so $16.1 billion in payments for specific purposes from the Commonwealth. So that's going to cover health, education, some other, I think, community housing, other purposes. In GST revenue, we'll get $14.8 billion, so $14,809 million in GST revenue that comes to Queensland through this Grants Commission formula. And the way that works is that, like, at the moment, we've the relativity, what they call the relativity, where they adjust our effective, that they say they adjust our actual population, and at the moment they're adjusting it up. And there's a formula that depends on, like, what disadvantages you have in your state. So if you're a vast state and it's harder to service your population, so we've got a lot of remote communities. If you've got a large Indigenous population or proportionally more Indigenous people, we would get more GST revenue because of that. And commodity prices figure into that. So we're getting a bit of a benefit because commodity prices have fallen they're not as high as they have been in the past. So there are all these factors that go into that formula. And at the moment, that means that we get, I think it's about 6% more per capita than we would otherwise. So we're winning there. We're getting what we probably arguably should be getting under those specific purpose payments for health and education. There are agreements that are agreed between the states and the Commonwealth, and there's a methodology there that we've agreed to. But yes, Cameron Dick's right that for this chunk of money, this $10 billion over a few years, or however many years it is, we arguably should have got more than that. So he's right in that respect, but there's a whole lot of money that comes to Queensland from the budget that Queensland's actually probably getting our fair share, and at the moment we may even be getting more than it because of the way the Grants Commission formula works.
But it's always the same, isn't it? When there's a bag of lollies around, and you don't think you've got your share of the lollies, like that's an extra payment sort of thing. There's a bag of lollies, and you only got a sherbet stick and a Mars bar, and someone got 2 Mars bars and a Chico bar sort of thing, or whatever. So there's always that jealousy and that comparison sort of thing.
There is,
and it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there is. And the other thing too is, it's infrastructure too. So it's not something that you can easily carve up in perfect shares, like fair shares, because it's going to depend on the nature of the projects and whether they're worthwhile. And it could be that at this time there are actually more worthwhile projects in other states. We hate to say that, but perhaps that's the case. You have to weigh these things up on a case by case basis. So without having seen what other projects were, all the full set of projects under consideration, it is difficult to make that judgment.
But you'd probably also have to look at the electorates tied up with that project, because they might be marginal or something, so it needs a bit of help. Now, that's probably one of the things with the Commonwealth I sort of gripes me a bit, that in the Constitution, when it was first organised, there was definite responsibilities and sharing of powers sort of thing. And over time, it seems to have sort of crossed over in a lot of, and the federal government is getting involved in too many things that really shouldn't happen to win votes in certain electorates. Like, it's a ridiculous situation with the Commonwealth, who's there to provide defence of the nation and other critical things for the nation, and states were supposed to look after health, states were supposed to look after education, but now you've got the Commonwealth fingers all in the pie sort of thing all over the place. And you've even got the situation where, come to election time, the Commonwealth is going around and deciding whether your local sports oval is going to get a toilet block. Now, that seems a little bit out of field for what the Commonwealth should be there. And I don't know how we're going to fix it, or whether there's any intention to fix it. But to me, if a federal government's got to stand up on its policies, that its duties under the Constitution. I mean, this government and all previous governments should all be sacked because they failed a basic. They're supposed to supply us with not ensure that we've got 90 days reserve of fuel. Now, no government in recent history has even managed to do that simple task. And that's one of their key things that they're supposed to do. But they can go and find the money to get a toilet block done on some oval in some electorate that may be marginal. I think that's a little bit of a corruption of the system.
Yeah, Bill. So you know how this has all come about, don't you? I mean, you'd be aware there's this what they call vertical fiscal imbalance. That's the technical name for it. The fact that it's the Commonwealth that has the major revenue raising powers. It took over the income tax during the Second World War, which arguably it needed to do, so Australia could fight
temporarily.
Yes, but what happened was I think New South Wales in the 50s challenged the Commonwealth. It wanted the income tax powers back. It's the second uniform tax case, they call it. It was a High Court case, and the High Court said, well, it's a bit late now. The Commonwealth's had it for so many years, and it's used to it. That's how things are. That's how it rolls. We just have to go with the flow now. Bad luck. And from time to time, there have been proposals to return the income tax power partly back to the states, and most recently, Malcolm Turnbull proposed that prior to a COAG, a Council of Australian Governments meeting in 2016. I remember because Steve Austin asked me about it on ABC Radio here, and I said, that's a great idea. And I was disappointed when Turnbull just backed away from it so quickly. As soon as there was any resistance from the states, he just backed away. He folded on it. It was really depressing. It turns out the states actually quite like the current arrangement. And there's a quote in Turnbull's autobiography where he quotes Anastasia Palaszczuk at a dinner at the lodge that night. And Palaszczuk says to him, well, we quite like the current arrangement because we get to spend the money and you get to, you suffer the political consequences of raising the tax. So it's quite... So the states probably don't want the tax power. They're perfectly happy to get the money from the Commonwealth and just to whinge about the Commonwealth not giving them enough from time to time. And then there's this whole blame game. They can blame the Commonwealth for not giving them enough.
Do you think it's sort of made states extremely lazy and not efficient? Like they could, like I'll pick on Tasmania in particular, because it's a smaller state, so we can, and it's offshore anyway. And if we cut the Bass Strait cable, they'll be out of power on one day or another. But they've got a situation where really, I think they get $1.78 or something like that per GST for every dollar they actually earn. So I can
tell you that exactly, Bill. Oh, okay, so Tasmania gets their relativity favours them, so they've got a relativity of 1.96.
Well, that's $1.96 per dollar.
Yep.
It was only $1.78 in 2018 when I first started.
Well, they change from year to year depending on those parameters that I mentioned.
So now you've got the situation. It's got its annual revenue, including GST and state taxes and the whole caboodle, I think comes just a bit under $6 billion. That's the total sum of its economy. Now, over 70% of its economy comes straight from Commonwealth grants. More than 70% actually comes from grants and that. So it doesn't leave the state much to do in regards to make up the difference. So it's embarked on a course of, I would say, or deindustrialisation. I mean, knock back great projects like the paper mill in the Tamar Valley, which was going to be the most modern paper plant in the world.
Was this guns? Is this guns you're talking about?
Yeah, guns went under as a result of that. And they've closed every bit of mining you can think of, because there was a lot of tin and zinc in Tasmania, and also basically shut up their forests. So they make nothing out of their natural resources or the natural assets. And it allows them to be, the federal government's grant largesse to them allows them to be extremely inefficient and embark on absolutely arrogant ideological missions in regards to renewables, to any sort of business structure that they want. So there's no incentive for them to be efficient, because they can simply sit on the Khyber and just hope they get more GST in the next allocation. So that's one of the problems with the GST situation at the moment, I think, is it makes state governments lazy, because they know this vast amount of money is going to come to them, and if they don't get their fair share, they'll whinge and carry on and come up with some, and usually they get some special payment somewhere along the line if they do a pretty good whinge. So, and I think that's corrupted the whole federation, our system of the federation.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that the system isn't perfect. That's right. And you've got that problem that you identified, that it is possible that you could have a state that's anti-development and it is deliberately holding itself back, and it could have more resources being mined or extracted. So gas, for example, there could be more gas extracted in Victoria and New South Wales, for example. The PC, the Productivity Commission, did look at this issue a couple of years ago. I think they might have put it in the too hard basket. I'll have to look back over what they concluded, but it's such a difficult one to try to figure out. How do you get that optimal formula? Because there is some logic in some sort of redistribution, okay, between states, because there are some states which are going to have superior revenue bases. Because you look at New South Wales and Victoria, and there are proportionally more wealthy people living in those states, and the property market is going to be, they're going to be more valuable property. So it's easier for them to raise money by stamp duty than it is for other states. And so you could argue that there is a need for some type of redistribution. They call it horizontal fiscal equalisation. The idea, or HFE, the idea is to try to make it, to make states, make it so that they have to exert the same level of effort to fund public services, or they can provide a similar level of public services. And okay, that sounds fair. If we're all Australians, why not?
Well, basically, that provides for the attempt to ensure that people, no matter where they are in Australia, have access to similar levels of service and infrastructure within a certain margin. I mean, you can only do so much. I mean, when you get 2,000 miles away from your capital city, and also in a very remote place, you can give them a lot of cash money and that, but you still can't give them all that service. Like, the grid's not there, the roads are not up to scratch, and you just never go to have the employment opportunities in those sort of places. So there are some limitations to those sort of things, but I think most people can accept that. But when it allows a state to be civically lazy or embark on a course, it's sort of counter productivity. And like, if we look at South Australia, I mean, it decided, we'll get rid of, we believe in renewables and all that, so we'll get rid of our coal-fired power station. But on the back of that, we'll hump into Victoria and back us up while we embark on this ideological journey. And they've had blackouts, they've had power price rises to the extent where businesses have had to close. I think one of the only plastic recycling places, PET plastics, was in South Australia, and their electricity bill went up about 30% in the first year. This is probably going back 4 or 5 years ago. So within 2 years of this change of direction by the South Australian government towards the renewables and the subsequent price increase, because the price couldn't be guaranteed, it fluctuated so much depending on how much they had to buy from Victoria and where the generator come from. So those costs were passed on to the consumers. Well, it was within 2 years that facility folded. And now I think there's only one plastic recycling venture act, and that's in New South Wales. So they're the sort of consequences of sort of, having access to other people's money rather than sort of managing your own properly.
Look, yes, I think there are issues with the Grants Commission formula and how it applies in practice and what it might mean for, or what that means for policies that different states will pursue. I think that's fair. What I would say, though, is that as Queenslanders, we should recognise that on average, we have benefited from this redistribution. We are beneficiaries of this Grants Commission process. Now, when I looked at the relativities, so this is the, when I quoted, was it $1.90 something before? So it's how many dollars you get compared with a benchmark of $1 if it was allocated on a equal per capita basis. Yeah. And on average, I think we've been getting like $1.02 or $1.03. So we've been getting 2 to 3% more on average over the last 2 decades since they introduced the GST than we would have.
It's been a lot higher than that.
Well, at different times it has.
Yeah. In 2018, I'm pretty sure we're up to about $1.16. Then we did a real big whinge when it went down to $1.09.
But we've had periods where
about $1.06, I think.
Yeah, at the moment it's around $1.06, but there have been times when it's been below $1, and that was when we had the very high coal prices in the recent past. And so on average over the last 20 years, it's been about, when I looked at it for my book a couple of years ago, it was around $1.02, $1.03. I'll have to update that figure. But what I'd say is that, on average, we have been beneficiaries of that process. So you're right that there are issues regarding what it means for policies in other states. At the same time, we should recognise that we've done well out of it. And I think partly that's because, from what I've seen, our state treasury is really good at making the arguments as to, you should adjust the formula in this way. And they're good at arguing for changes that advantage Queensland from what I've seen. And I think it was about 20 years ago, I remember the Government Statisticians Office, the Office of Economic and Statistical Research, they had a campaign where they encouraged people, Queenslanders, to identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander if they had the, if they had the necessary, if they were actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, if they had the ancestry. They're not saying lie about it, but they noticed that they thought there was an undercounting. People weren't nominating that on the census form. And so they encourage that, because the more Indigenous people we have as a proportion of the population, the more dollars we get via GST. You don't necessarily have to spend the money on the Indigenous. This is one of the great scandals.
It's a big pool.
Yeah, but it helps us get more money. So, yeah, I remember that the Treasury did that. That was back, 20 or 25 years ago. They had a campaign along those lines, and that was very clever. That was a very smart thing to do from Queensland's perspective.
I have had a look at the Grants Commission's annual report, last year's annual report, and it is interesting in regards to all the different things that they assess. And like you say, they basically have a big bag of money, and then they decide how much is going into these different categories, and then they'll look at that category state by state. And as you said, in regards to remote communities and Indigenous and things like that, there might be X number of $1 billion. And what they do is, well, let's have a look at the total number of people under that category and divide it by that number. And then they sit down and sort of, well, where are these people? And they find, well, because a lot of Queensland is sparsely populated, and it has the biggest regional population of any state. So you've got all these communities in remote communities and outback towns and things like that. So to provide service and deliver service is more costly. So that bag of money, deliver the same service approximately, you have to may spend for a person in Charters Towers or Mount Isa, say, you might have to do it, multiply it by a factor of 2 because of the distance. And then if you look at Normanton or Cominyara or Arakoon or something like that, well, then there's another factor. And it's interesting, this one pool of money goes across the line, and then you'll see Queensland gets X number of dollars, which is plus above the norm. And then you see New South Wales is so many millions of dollars below the norm. And then Victoria, because it's much smaller and doesn't have that sort of problem, this category, it's down further. So it varies in all those categories. It's a very interesting exercise, and I'd expect it must take some awful number crunching efforts to sort of come out with the final dollars and cents for each state, for each of those categories, and then be prepared to stand up and justify them to a Senate inquiry or something like that you've got to face once in a while.
Yeah, well, I think the big challenge they have is justifying it to the states, and because the states will always whinge. I mean, WA has been whinging a lot, and WA's ended up getting a special deal. I don't know if you saw that. The Commonwealth promised that their relativity wouldn't fall below a certain amount. I think they wouldn't get less than 70 cents in the dollar or whatever it was. And
well, they were down to 30 cents in the dollar. Which is criminal. I mean, you're penalising a state that's got off its butt and sort of helped the mining industry or whatever, and getting gains from it, and then gets completely crucified for it.
Yeah. And so that was the argument. And so if Queensland was, because, if we had iron ore in Queensland, we'd certainly be making the same argument, but we've got coal. And I mean, at times coal has been really good. So, I mean, we've had high coal prices. I mean, maybe a few years ago now, but they've come off. So they're quite volatile. So we don't get quite the same. We don't have quite the same revenue raising ability through coal as WA has through royalties on iron ore. Yeah. But
I think they did have, might be a bit biased, I'm from West Australia originally, but there was such an influx of population into Western Australia because of the mining industry. And with the fly in, fly out, it left heaps of big families in that coming to West Australia into Perth, and it was expanding rapidly. So you needed the infrastructure and that. And they needed the money for the infrastructure to provide for these extra families and the new roads and that. And so that was basically, they tried to emphasise that to the Commonwealth. Yeah, it's fair enough we're getting all this extra revenue from the ore, but we also got this huge influx of people. We've got to provide the children with education, schools, we've got to provide roads, we've got to create new suburbs, we've got to provide sewage, we've got to do this. So that was a legitimate case, but I don't think they actually advanced too far. And I can understand some of the resentment West Australia felt, and it's actually rekindled the movement for WA exit, which I'm not sure if you're across the 1930s, 1933 referendum to secede from the Commonwealth. Well, I remember that as a kid, and my dad told, I mean, I was too young to do it, but my dad told me about it, sort of thing. But I always assumed it was lost. The vote was lost. It's only recently I delved into it a bit further, but the vote West Australian public voted in favour by nearly 70% to 30%. But it got turned down in those days. We were still answerable to the British Parliament, and the British Parliament ruled on it, said it was a null and void referendum because of some technical matters. And I suppose the thing that sort of didn't fight that decision was because we're going into the Depression. It probably wasn't a good time to leave the Commonwealth anyway. Out of that, that's where I think we got our horizontal fiscal equalisation, because I think that, the history, the Commonwealth is considered this away from the sheer population basis of distributing revenue.
Yeah, that's quite possible. I wasn't aware of all that history. That's a fascinating story. I'll have to look more into that. It is quite possibly, yeah. I mean, we were we were answerable to the UK up until 1986 with the passage of the Australia Act. Technically, I think you still could appeal High Court decisions to the Privy Council.
To the Privy Council.
Yeah. So there was
Amazing.
still, yeah.
See, a lot of people don't even realise that there was no such thing as an Australian until about 1947. Before that, we were all just British subjects, and people might complain. The first people complain about they were never considered Australians. Well, nor were we. We were British subjects, and so were they. Everyone in the Commonwealth at that time, British Empire, we were all British subjects. We weren't Australians. We weren't Indians. We weren't Canadians, or I think Canada might have shifted out by then, but other people in the Commonwealth, we were British subjects, and that's what you had in your passport.
Yes. I'll have to look more into that history, Bill. It's fascinating. I'd just like to, could we go back to that point about the Commonwealth power? And you did make that point about how the Commonwealth has taken over and it's entered into all of these areas that you wouldn't expect it to be in, particularly health and education. And that's been going on for, decades. Was it Menzies who funded science blocks in Catholic schools, for example, and that started the Commonwealth getting involved in funding schools? And then you had the big investments in universities. So it's been going on for a while. But one thing that struck me about last year and this year is the states still have a lot of power, right? So the states are the ones who are delivering the response to COVID. I think COVID has seen the resurgence of the states, and at times I've been quite stunned at the impotence of the Commonwealth. There are times I was thinking, well, I wish I was thinking the federal government should be doing more to keep the state borders open. I know that's an unpopular position in Queensland, but I thought there were things that the Commonwealth should have been doing to actually, have a more coherent and rational national response to COVID.
I think the thing is, what it's also showing up is the states not exercising their power when it really should for all other matters, and sort of just riding on the skirt tails of the Commonwealth as far as the funding and that. So they seem to suit themselves rather than have a rigid principle. And I think we really need to go back and sort of start making state and federal governments abide by the Constitution in its original format. But there again, I suppose it boils down to laziness, and if you don't have to do something, someone just gives you a bucket of money, well, so be it.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think if you are going to be a strict constitutionalist, I think we should take the opportunity to look at what's in the Constitution, because I wouldn't want to say, let's just apply the Constitution strictly without having a look at it and seeing that it is actually sensible from a modern day perspective. That's just one thing I'd say there.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of things in the Constitution probably could do with a review, but then whether you ever get them passed by a referendum is another thing, because we're not too handy at passing referendums too much. And one section I'd like to see go is section 95, where the Commonwealth has power to grant money to the states for odd purposes. And that was fair in the initial part. It was there to sort of say when the fledgling states, especially West Australia and Tasmania, were first getting underway, the Commonwealth could sort of prop them up. But 120 years on, I think that's gone past the board, and all the states, especially the founding states, should be all standing on their own feet now. I just wonder if we could I'll share a screen in regards to this year's budget, because this is
okay.
It's basically, we'll just have a quick look at the revenue and then the overall allocation of the spend.
Bill, a couple of things. Just while you're doing that, I just thought it'd be good. Okay.
Go ahead first.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say that one other thing we should note is that the Commonwealth has committed to doing something positive for North Queensland with that reinsurance arrangement, hasn't it? Which is designed to help keep insurance costs down. So that's just one thing I should note. So we were saying before that, of that $10 billion in infrastructure spending, you could argue that Queensland should have got more out of that. But there are other things in the budget that do benefit Queensland, and particularly regional Queenslanders.
The insurance pool is the bucket of money that may exist or may not exist, and may need to be accessed one time or other. But I find my issue with the reinsurance pool, it's a complete failure of the government to make the insurance company come to heel, and make them sort of, well, if you're not in the market to insure all Australians, well, then let's cancel your license and you can go somewhere else. But I think banks have got licenses. They've got to be licensed. Insurance company, I'm pretty sure, got license, and I think maybe they should need to look at the terms of those licenses. And if insurance companies are only going to offer insurances in Melbourne and Sydney, or some, I wouldn't really recommend Brisbane because it's smashed by hailstorms too much. But if you're going to be so selective about where you go to insure that, well, then maybe you shouldn't be in them. You shouldn't be allowed in the market. And I think really the government's sort of taken an easy way out rather than tackle the industry itself. But that's another matter. Just up on the screen, we've got the revenue, and you can. I think our overall revenue is a little bit down. I think it's only under 500 billion. I'm pretty sure we've been over 500 billion before, but that's the revenue and the methods of picking eyes out of people and companies and individuals. Is there any? Do you think there's any tax that maybe underachieving or overachieving or is a detriment? Like, we've had the fringe benefits tax. I remember that. I remember the whinging when that first came in regards to. Now it collects $4.1 billion, but say if there was no fringe benefit tax and people went out to lunch and put it on the company's expenses and all those, sometimes I think it might inject more money in the economy that you might get back in wages and other companies' profits taxes if we didn't have that tax. And plus, it's a big mechanism. It's a fairly convoluted mechanism to run. Like, it's a big impost on business for the mechanism to account for it. And I presume you need another bunch of bureaucrats in the ATO to run it. So it's something like that. So,
Bill, it's one of the major reasons our Taxation Act is so long. So, yeah, fringe benefits does add a lot of complexity to it. That's a difficult one because there was a view that there was a lot of rorting of things like expense accounts and the way that people were granted meal allowances and things like that, or school fees were paid for children, and that was seen as a form of, well, that's a form of compensation, and people weren't being taxed on it. It forms effectively part of their income. So the tax office, the Treasury, was concerned about tax evasion. And look, if you didn't have fringe benefits tax, you'd probably see a lot more of those type of arrangements. There'd be concerns about loss of revenue. I can see the logic for fringe benefits tax. but you're right. I mean, I think it did have a big impact on the hospitality sector when it came in. There was a bit of a shock, and
yeah. That's all I'm suggesting in regards to, although it gets revenue at this point of collection, if it didn't exist, there might be greater revenue to collect at another endpoint. With the hotels, restaurants, and anyway, the money gets spent. Someone ends up getting it and has to pay tax on it anyway. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of different. There's there's about eight odd areas of collection, and that's the smallest. You think there's other excise? I mean, is that grog? I wonder. But do you think that we could? Have you ever looked at another nation's tax pie sort of thing and have something a bit more streamlined, or is ours one of the more reasonable tax regimes?
ooh, this is a good question. This is a really meaty question. I think we'd have to spend another hour on this. The argument that has been made by many economists, I'm not necessarily one of them, is that we probably raise more from individual income tax than is desirable. There's an argument that we should be raising more from indirect taxes such as the GST. So if you look at countries in the EU, I mean, doesn't it, or is it the UK? Does it have a VAT, a value-added tax rate of?
With food and everything, 15%, I think.
Yeah, and I think some countries have 20%. So you could argue that we should move to having a higher rate of GST, cutting income taxes. Okay, so what are the benefits of cutting income taxes? It encourages work effort, allegedly. I mean, there's probably some truth to that. High tax rates do discourage people from working at the margins. I mean, there's debates about just how much that's the case. Sorry, Bill, I've just... Sorry about that. Just something in my throat then. Yeah, so there's debates about the extent to which income taxes are bad for your labour supply and whether you'd get better outcomes if you cut income tax and increase GST. So there's been an argument about that. The problem with the GST, of course, is it's regressive. So with income taxes, the wealthier you are, or the higher income you are, the more you pay proportionally. But with GST, because wealthier households tend to save more of their income, or they're not spending it on consumption goods as a share of their income, the GST is lower than it is for poorer households, and it's not, the rate of tax does not depend on your income, so it's not progressive. It's arguably regressive. So that's one of the problems with GST.
I'll just look up where we spent it. This is the pie chart for where we spent it, and I'd see defence is nearly 6% at the moment, which is up on recent years. But I suppose we've got to sort some money away for those obsolete submarines we've got to buy. So.
Oh, don't get me started on that. Look, defence, I mean, relative to the United States, for example, that's probably low. I don't know their figures off the top of my head, but look, it's a national government. I mean, that's one of the main responsibilities of a national government, defence and foreign affairs. So look, it makes sense that defence is possibly of that magnitude, if not higher.
I think it should be higher, but the thing is, I think there it shouldn't be used to help someone win a seat in South Australia.
No, I agree. Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
think it's the most appalling decision in the defence world that we're going to buy something on the Never Never that's going to cost us probably twice as much than what we've originally scheduled for it, and it's going to take 30 years to deliver. I mean, I hope that it doesn't matter when they turn up; they'll be useless anyway, so it's irrelevant.
Well,
But,
what I've heard is that what we should be investing in are these drones. I mean, these drones are just incredible what they can do. That's what that's what we should be investing in.
Well, I agree with that 100%, and especially when we've got probably the biggest anchored aircraft carrier in the world from which to launch them, and they operate 24/7. You can have ones that do surveillance, are fairly cheap, can go out there, and then you have the ones that do the attack drones. So, I do understand up in Queensland in Cloncurry there is a lot of testing with drones. We've got, I think,
Right.
we've got Bell's one company. I think there's about four. I think there's one Australian company and three overseas companies using Cloncurry Airport and the airspace up there testing drones. But it's definitely something we should get in and sort of, encourage countries like Singapore that have basically got no airspace. And there's a lot of small countries that have basically got no airspace that come to Australia and sort of advance their aeronautical expertise here. That's another game for Australia and Queensland. Do you think? I don't know. Have you kept a sort of bit of an eye over the years on the social security and welfare slice of the pie?
Oh, look, that's growing because of NDIS. So one of the big stories from this budget, Bill, is that the amount that will be spent on NDIS by the end of the forward estimates period by 24-25 financial year will exceed the amount that's spent on Medicare. So it'll be around 31 billion or something. I don't know if I'm getting that figure exactly right, but it's going to grow to be larger than Medicare.
I also think NDIS is, because of the lack of definitions in a lot of instances, it's subject to rorting. And I think the industry, the carer industry for NDIS is making a pretty good feast of it. And it's probably going to do a lot of damage to our economy over the long term.
Well, it's certainly costly. I mean, look, there are the challenge we've got is that there are a lot of people who need assistance out there, Bill. There are a lot of people in need, and it's very difficult to know where to draw the line. I mean, no doubt there's going to be some rorting, but that's not the major. The major challenge is that there's just, depending on how you define disability, it's such an expansive scheme. So when it was first raised, when the idea of it, I remember going to meetings on the initial concept in the early 2000s, because there's always been this issue of people who fall through the cracks. So if you were catastrophically injured in an accident, so say you were diving into a creek, and a shallow creek, and you didn't realize, and then you become a quadriplegic, and you wouldn't be covered by workers' compensation, you wouldn't be covered by the third-party insurance or whatever it is, and so you could fall through the cracks, and you don't have any compensation to help you through the rest of your life to get assistance with care. And so there was always a view that, well, we really need to do something about that. We need to provide some assistance for people who are catastrophically injured. And that sort of work was occurring in the 2000s. And then Kevin Rudd had his 2020 summit, and the idea came up, well, why don't we have a national disability insurance scheme where you address that concern that there are people who are catastrophically injured who aren't getting looked after, which was a big concern. But then, we should look after this greater range of people, because currently we've got state and local government services who are providing some assistance, and it's just not enough and it's inconsistent across regions. Let's have a national scheme. The challenge is, it's just, how do you define that, and where do you draw the line, and what level of service? And at the moment, I mean, we are trying to provide a really, I think, a high level of service, and I mean, that's fair. I mean, I think, look, I think we do want to make sure people who have a disability are looked after. I mean, on equity grounds. So I think there is a justification for the NDIS. That the challenge is doing it in a cost-effective way. And what we've seen is that the judgments that have been made in the system, they are leading to this high growth in costs.
Well, I think that was the problem. It was the definition side and categorization that sort of, opened up a can of worms. And then there's always challenges, and then usually the system errs on the side of generosity, and it becomes a growing financial problem. So, talking about growing financial problems, I'll just flick up our our forecast debt.
How are we going for time, Bill? Do we need to wrap up?
We'll wrap it up in a minute. I'll just get to our little.
Sure. One thing I should note is that I know you introduced me as the Vice President of Economic Society. I should have updated my bio with you, because I haven't been on the committee for a couple of years. I'm still a member, but I'm not on the committee. But anyway, that's. I was vice president a couple of years ago.
We'll just make it former.
Yes.
So what I'll just see on what you see on the screen, I'm just interested in the one in the middle, gross debt. And it's rising. And I don't know why people aren't scared of this, but because somewhere along the line, someone has to pay for it. So we always used to sort of give Labor a caning for bad budgets and rising debt, but gee whiz, I think we're not doing too good in the capital at the moment.
Okay, so I think obviously we've had the pandemic, we had the downturn, and there's been a whole bunch of money spent to deal with it, and emergency measures, stimulus. So you expect some growth in debt, of course. What concerns me most is that if you look at what their projections are out to 2030, we're just going to continue deficits. There's no idea or no plan to eventually get back to surplus. That's not in the current budget projections, which is, I found that quite extraordinary. I thought they would have done something to try to get it back to surplus eventually, or to argue that, well, at least over the rest of the decade, we will control expenses to get back to surplus eventually. But there's just no conception of that at the moment. No plan for that.
I think one of the most concerning thing is that it's recurring debt. Like it's just in day-to-day sort of government expenditure. There's no capital spend, very little capital spending or asset spending where you got to get a return or economic growth. I think that's the most worrying concern. And just touching on that, how well do you think Queensland will deal with the amount of money it's got? And then how do you feel it should allocate money, and will the region sort of do well out of the next lot of state budget, you think, as a result of the money given to the state from this federal government?
That's a good question, Bill. I think the state government is more conscious of the regions, and like last election, it did well in the regions, really, and it's picked up some new seats, and so I think it will be trying to keep hold of those. So look, the regions may well do well out of this budget. I don't have any great insight into what they do. I think what they'll do, or what new spending they're planning, but Yeah, let's see what happens. I mean, it may be that they will try and keep hold of some of those regional seats. So I think they picked up one in Bundaberg, didn't they? I know that's one area that they're.
Yeah, they also picked they picked up in the Blue Heartland on the Gold Coast as well. They actually picked up in Southeast fairly well, but I think the election was a little bit skewed by COVID and people's preference. Well, they've kept us safe, and it doesn't matter if the border closures destroyed thousands of businesses and closed restaurants and all those sort of things. Because, and if you're making the case like we're spending money because of the COVID problem and things like that, but COVID didn't do anything. The COVID disease itself didn't impact it on us at much at all. Maybe Victoria had a bad outbreak, and maybe basically from bad management, but all the economic damage was basically caused from regulation and rules that governments put in place that did the harm. And it was, rather than manage COVID-19, they sort of, well, let's not have the problem at all, and we'll just shut everything down. So that seemed to work to the advantage of all the state governments, because all the governments that went to elections won handsomely during the COVID. So it's probably, hopefully by the next election in 2024, we haven't got any problems like that, and we can actually vote on what the parties is going to deliver to people in regards to fixing crime in regional Queensland, projects that they deliver, and we will vote on that rather than just kept us safe sort of thing. So we'll get back to those normal sort of things. Anyway, it has gone 8 o'clock. So I'd just like to wind up now.
Yeah,
Thank
Bill,
you
do
very
we want to
much for
just
your time?
Yeah, sorry. Did we just want to chat about the debt one a bit more? Because I think that's an important issue. One thing I would note is that, I mean, the reason we're sort of a bit blasé about it all at the moment is because interest rates are at historic lows. So the government's borrowing at, I don't know, on average 1% or something, or in over 10 years, I think it's a bit higher than that now. But let's just say on average 1% per annum. And that's the interest rate it's paying. And so that means that it's taken on all this extra debt, but the interest bill hasn't really increased much. So I think it's around $20 billion or so. But what's going to happen when interest rates rise, then that interest bill is going to be higher, and that's going to force future governments to have to repair the budget. They will have to, because they have to pay that interest bill out of the revenues they're getting. And so they either have to increase taxes or not cut them as they may have, so not give back bracket creep, or they will have to cut expenses because they have to pay that interest bill. So that's going to be a big problem in the future, and we're going to be paying for that. You can argue that, well, debt, we hand it on to future generations. That's true, but we also have to pay the servicing costs of the debt, the interest cost of the debt.
That repayment, but is when the higher interest rates come into effect, is when it's after the current debt falls due. Like they borrow every year, and then they have to actually pay out certain loans over time. So it's probably when they have to go and decide, are we going to reborrow, keep that debt, or are we going to pay it off?
Well, I mean, it's so large, Bill, that they've got no choice but to reborrow, to refinance it, to borrow new money to pay off the bondholders, the owners of the bonds that are maturing.
Do we know who owns our debt?
Broadly, we know the proportion that's held by foreigners and the proportion that's held by Australians. It's rough. It's at times it's been, I think it's been 80% at times for the foreign holders. That we owe the money in Australian dollars, so it's not as if we owe it in US dollars or another currency. It is owed in Australian dollars, but at times we've had high foreign ownership, and it could be foreign central banks, it could be foreign investment funds, hedge funds, with central banks, People's Bank of China, for example, European Central Bank, Federal Reserve, but investment funds here in Australia. So with fixed income. So if there's a fixed income component in your super fund or your mutual fund, that would contain Australian government bonds, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, we just hope there's not too much of the Central Bank of China that we owe and have to fall default to, because they have a bad habit of sort of taking things over. Like I think Sri Lanka did a deal with them on the Belts and Road, and they're certainly paying for it at the moment when they defaulted. I think they lost a fair bit of their infrastructure to the Chinese government.
Well,
so
I guess
there are consequences.
Yeah. I guess the difference there is, Bill, that Sri Lanka's probably borrowed in foreign currency. I mean, they would have had to pay the Chinese in yuan, or US dollars, who knows, whatever the deal was. Whereas we just have to pay our bondholders back in Australian dollars. So I wouldn't want to get into modern monetary theory, and I'm not a proponent of that. But I mean, worst case, we could always just
print more money.
Print the money to.
print
I'm
more
not
money
advocating that.
Value.
Not advocating that, but see that's the worst case. That's why if domestic denominated debt is less of an issue than foreign denominated debt. But of course, you still have to be concerned about it. I'm not advocating that policy, but we should always be. We should never be, as Australians, given that our debt compared with some other economies is our federal debt as relative to some other economies such as the US or Japan, it's relatively low. It's high compared with what we've had historically, except in wartime, but it's low relative to those other countries. And we shouldn't end up in a problem. We shouldn't be facing the prospect of default. That's not likely, but we will face the problem of higher interest costs in the future and governments having to make adjustments to the budget because of that.
But it basically boils down, you should have good money measurements all the time, rather than think, oh, well, we'll put it off for another day, another generation.
Well, I think so. And what concerned me with that budget is that those medium-term projections where they show that, oh, well, we don't expect the budget will get back into surplus over the projection period. So we'll have a decade of deficits, which means we would have had over 2 decades of deficits since we went into deficit during the financial crisis back in 08-09. So we're not going to see a surplus until sometime in the 2030s, possibly.
I think the other concerning factor is they don't seem to be thinking of growing our economy in regards to wealth creation projects. I think that's one of the concerns. If they just don't fit, well, we expect debt to run. That means it's sort of, well, you're not really planning on being or encouraging projects that's going to raise a lot of revenue and pay a lot of taxes, and that's concerning.
Yeah, well, that would be a better use of the money than some of the purposes they're putting it to now. Of course, you've got to make sure that those projects stack up. So we'd want to discuss what specific projects you're talking about, Bill. But in general, as a principle, I think, yeah, fair enough.
Well, I think one cab off the rank we could go straight away with Zion Boomerang, and get this, which is bringing ore from West Australia and transferring coal back to West Australia, and having steel plants on both sides of the continent, and revitalising industrialisation in Australia, which is sadly lacking. But that's for another show. I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. We're well until over time. It was a pleasure speaking with you tonight. I'll just wrap up now and introduce next week's show. If you can stay on the line, I'll chat with you a little while after. Thank you. Thanks, Gene. All right.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. That's episode 7 of Regional Wrap. Next week, we'll have David Landini on from New South Wales. He's the party president of the Riverina State Party, and they're engaged in trying to get a separate state in New South Wales for the Riverina. They have an existing problem for them is that there's only 10 state seats west of the Great Divide, and in the 93 state legislative assembly, they're actually not having a voice. So that's the challenge for them in the future. So until next week, thanks very much. Join us again. If you enjoy the show, please like, follow and share on Facebook. And also, if you're viewing on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much. We'll see you again next week.